Why do people overeat?
So, for me, it really just comes down to satiety per calorie, and I know that you feel the same way. I mean, that's basically your idea, is that it comes down to satiety per calorie. And so for me, it's all about this satiety per calorie concept. And if everyone's going to eat to satiety, and if it took too many calories for you to get there, then you're just going to steadily gain weight. And I think there's a couple major drivers. Number one, energy density. So, you're going to eat your 4 or 5 pounds of food. Sweet potatoes, yams, what the Catawbans were eating, it's a very low energy density food. It's 1 calorie per gram. So you can eat 4 or 5 pounds of yams and it's only 2,000 calories. So you're just literally not going to get fat on this food. So versus, half a cup of sugar and a half cup of oil would be 2,000 calories. And that's your satiety would be absolutely zero. Like you'd be starving after that. So the refinement of carbs and fats dilutes out nutrients, and you get this higher energy density, nutrient devoid. So the energy density is higher and the nutrient density is lower at the same time. And you're just going to automatically overeat calories for the same amount of satiety. And it's protein dilution, it's mineral dilution, it's refined carbs and refined fats. I think that's half of the obesity epidemic. So half the obesity epidemic is refinement of carbs and fats that dilute out protein and nutrients, and you have to passively overeat calories to get satiety. The other half is the hedonic nature of high energy density carbs and fats together. You can give a refined carb and a refined fat together to any omnivore mammal, and it will automatically overeat by 30 to 40% of calories because it spikes dopamine in your brain, and it's so freaking tasty. And that's why even if you know what you're supposed to be eating, you're going to be eating pizza and donuts because it's freaking amazing. And that's a full 50% of the obesity epidemic. It's just the hedonic overdrive of refined carbs and refined fats together. So I see this push-pull thing where obesity is being, pushed forward by passive dilution of nutrients from refined carbs and refined fats, but then pulled forward by the tasty hedonic nature of refined carbs and refined fats together. And you put those two together, and like everybody's, 91% of the entire world is over fat now.
Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Geek ninguém.
O melhor humano.
Welcome back, friends. I'm Brian Sanders, and this is the Peak Human Podcast. I'm also the owner of notesatale.org, where you can get all kinds of properly raised meats, and the creator of the Food Lies film. We continue to work on the film daily and are just as desperate to finish it and get it out to the world as you are. I know it's taking longer than expected, but we are making something truly special, and there are a lot of factors we're dealing with. It will be worth it, trust me. This episode today is very special and a long time in the making. I got the top 2 audience favorites on one podcast. This nutrition stuff is so complex, it's never enough to get one side of the story, so I thought I could at least get 2. I try to stay out of giving my opinions in this one. Perhaps 3 would be a crowd. We talk about so many interesting topics, such as the carbohydrate-insulin model of obesity, the alternatives to this, the personal fat threshold, the insulin model of disease, which is separate from how one becomes overweight, satiety and how it fits into this, the processing of foods and how it plays in, basal insulin versus bolus, the satiety versus calorie theory, and a lot more. We also have the big PUFA debate. Are they as bad as they're made out to be? I think they are, but these two don't seem to think there's anything uniquely problematic with them other than they supply empty calories and we eat way too much of them. So just to reiterate, they do think you should cut them out. I try not to interject much. I'm not trying to insert myself too much into these discussions. I have all kinds of guests on my show with differing opinions to expose people to all the angles of this complex nutrition world. I think with these guys in PUFAs, especially omega-6, is that they haven't spent enough time really digging into these details. They have busy lives and are focused on other areas of health. Just an idea. What we're really looking at here is the mystery of what goes on with the food we eat and its role in disease and our obesity. Everyone should be interested in this to some extent. Maybe not to the level of a 90-minute podcast and to some of the small details, but these are important questions that need to be answered. Dr. Ted Naiman is a board-certified family medicine physician in the Department of Primary Care at a leading major medical center in Seattle. His research and medical practice are focused on the practical implementation of diet and exercise for health optimization. He has an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and utilizes engineering principles when dealing with complex systems such as human health and nutrition. Dr. Ben Bikman is a researcher and professor specializing in metabolic function, insulin resistance, and the drivers of metabolic disease. He has a PhD in bioenergetics. He did a postdoctoral fellowship with the Duke National University of Singapore in metabolic disorders, and he's currently exploring the contrasting roles of insulin and ketones as key drivers of metabolic function. Now, this is a podcast I think everyone should be excited about. Can't wait to hear your thoughts. Please share this with a friend or family. Give it a review on iTunes. Start back at episode 1. All these things are great ways to support the show. You can also support my work while giving yourself some good food, some good nutrition, and some great products by going to nosetotale.org. I teamed up with some great ranchers and product producers that are the best at what they do, and we have some great products out there, including our primal ground beef with all the organs mixed in, liver, heart, kidney, and spleen. We have low PUFA pork and chicken. We have all kinds of meats. You can make a custom box and ship them to your door. There's free shipping options. We also have the biltong and drovors. This is a South African specialty, grass-fed meat on the go. We have the seasonings. We have body care products just coming back in stock. You got to check these out. nosetotale.org. Great products, great regenerative practices used. Win, win, win all around. nosetotale.org. For everything else, go to sapien.org. And now let's get on to Bill and Ted's excellent adventure with my two pals. Let's do it. All right, guys, we got the dream team together. This is by audience request. People are very excited. Two maybe most popular guys I've ever had on. I think I've had you on twice, both of you. But how's it going, Ted?
Oh, great. Thanks for having me on. It's great to talk to you guys. This is awesome. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And Ben, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Thanks, guys. This is just great. Two friends, always glad to have a chat about all things metabolic and whatever else comes to our minds. Anything with COVID, right?
Okay. Yeah, we won't touch that, but we're going to get into all kinds of stuff. I've got some requests for, people want to know these details. You guys both have really great ideas. Everyone just loves your content, and we want to see where we're overlapping. Maybe there's a little bit of non-overlap. We're definitely not having a debate. We talked about that, and let's just discuss it. And this stuff is so interesting to me. Why we got fat and sick, how we got here, how do we get out of it? This stuff is just all I think about. So I don't even know where to start. How do people become insulin resistant? Maybe, is that the root of I know Ben wrote a whole book on why we get sick, but maybe start with Ted. How do you think we get fat and sick? Like, is it insulin resistance? What is it?
Well, okay. So insulin resistance, there are different tissues in your body that can be insulin resistant, but whole body insulin resistance pretty clearly involves several tissue compartment insulin resistance. Usually starts with muscle insulin resistant, which is where your muscle is basically not accepting glucose, typically because it's already filled with fat or triglycerides or glucose, and it doesn't want any more glucose. So there you have muscle insulin resistance, which shows up first. Then you have subcutaneous fat cell insulin resistance, which is where the first place you're supposed to store fat is in your subcutaneous fat cells. And when they reach a maximum diameter, they become insulin resistant too. And then those free fatty acids spill over and end up in your visceral fat. And now you get insulin resistance at the level of the visceral fat once you've maximally expanded all those fat cells. And then kind of the final destination is the liver. The last thing that happens is you get fatty liver, and that's when you become diabetic. And basically 100% of type 2 diabetics have fatty liver. And it's really this 4-phase cascade: muscle insulin resistance, subcutaneous fat cell insulin resistance, visceral fat cell insulin resistance, and then finally liver insulin resistance. And now you're a type 2 diabetic, and none of your whole body is just overfilled with energy, fat and glucose. None of your cells accept energy. And then basically insulin's high all the time because it's trying to clear fuels out of the bloodstream, but it's unable to do so because none of the cells want it. And that's kind of type 2 diabetes and the kind of end stage insulin resistance of your whole body. And basically, all of this is created by ingesting too much energy.
I love it. Ben, do you have anything to add to that, or do you agree?
Yeah. Well, so I think, first of all, Brian, I think you laid it out well, where there's really two separate topics here, which is one, obesity, and then distinct from that is insulin resistance. So just to make it that we're clear for the listener, we're talking about insulin resistance, and I actually prefer that topic because I'm more comfortable with it. Obesity, I think, is frankly a little muddier. So I like Ted's explanation. Ted, I think that's a good way to lay it. I actually personally put the adipocyte first, only because to my knowledge, so this legendary scientist Jerry Schulman, he also is a muscle cell. He looks at the muscle cell as the primary organ that becomes insulin resistant. But in all of his models, and I think all of the models, it is always contingent on an excess fat load that is causing the like a lipotoxicity that initiates the insulin resistance in the muscle. And so I can't help but then say, well, what could be responsible for that excess lipid load, the excess, say, free fatty acids, or triglycerides, of course, and that wouldn't be coming from the fat cell. The latter wouldn't. But I do put the adipocyte first. So in my paradigm, the adipocyte becomes insulin resistant first. Now, you could have varying degrees. As much as Ted or I are going to be speaking about this in kind of absolute terms, I think we'd both admit I am unaware of any absolute evidence that has indicated a very precise timeline to this. I'm unaware of it. So a lot of this is, in fact, speculation, even my own thoughts now. So my speculation is that the adipocyte becomes insulin resistant first, just like Ted said, through excessive hypertrophy. And there are various inputs that go into that, energy and insulin, I would say. And that's something where Ted and I have interesting thoughts, kind of an energy-based paradigm and an insulin-based paradigm. But nevertheless, the adipocyte gets hypertrophic, and two critical things happen that then, in my view, start to spill the insulin resistance throughout the rest of the body, which is it starts leaking free fatty acids, and that is reflective of it becoming insulin resistant directly, where insulin isn't capable of inhibiting lipolysis. So that is the insulin resistance component of the hypertrophic fat cell. The second is that as the fat cell hypertrophies, they're each pushing each other further and further from capillaries, and they become increasingly hypoxic. And that then, in an effort to survive, introduces the second relevant variable to systemic insulin resistance, or it's spreading elsewhere, and that is the release of pro-inflammatory proteins. And I don't mean to introduce inflammation kind of too early in this conversation, or even introduce a character that's irrelevant. I do think it is, partly just because of my own studies published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation. We found that inflammation really is a critical variable for muscle cell insulin resistance specifically, but in fact, you could say the same about liver and the hypothalamus and other tissues. So the hypertrophic fat cell is essentially trying to survive. It becomes insulin resistant so that it doesn't reach a significant, such a dimension or a proportion that it can't sustain its own size. There is a maximal size. So it becomes insulin resistant to mitigate its growth. And then second, it becomes pro-inflammatory to try to stimulate the growth of new blood vessels, because some of those so-called pro-inflammatory proteins are, in fact, vascular endothelial growth factors that are trying to enhance blood flow through the tissue so that the cells aren't hypoxic anymore. But again, those two efforts that the hypertrophic fat cell is undergoing to ensure its own survival end up resulting in doom for the rest. And then I would put muscle. So to me, insulin resistance starts in the fat cell, and then as Ted mentioned, this transition into frank type 2 diabetes, that is no question the involvement. I look at that as the next step, where now you have affected the muscle, which now can't pull in glucose because, of course, muscle consumes the overwhelming majority of glucose. And then the liver becomes insulin resistant, so it's pumping out glucose when it shouldn't. And then third, and admittedly perhaps a more minor character, that would be the alpha cells of the pancreas become insulin resistant, and now they're secreting too much glucagon when they shouldn't. And we know that glucagon does tend to be up in diabetic states. certainly with type 1, but that's an extreme example, but even type 2. So I believe it starts at the fat cell, and then once that insulin resistance goes to muscle, especially liver also, and then maybe even alpha cells of the pancreas, now we've blown the roof off the top, and now glucose skyrockets and they're diabetic. But of course, all this is distinct from obesity, which is a different topic, but certainly related.
Oh, maybe we can kind of discern that. And just to make sure people know, hypertrophic means hypertrophy means the fat cells are getting bigger. Hyperplasia means, they're multiplying, getting more of them. Maybe Ted could jump in and kind of respond to what you said or go deeper into that.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, basically, you have a certain number of fat cells on your body. And as they get bigger and bigger, there is this maximum size that they physically cannot exceed. So as you get larger fat cells, you start multiplying the number of fat cells. Basically, you'll take some stem cells and convert them into adipocytes. And this is something that is super genetic. Like, how many fat cells can you sprout? We have people from Southeast Asia who are very genetically limited in how many fat cells they can have. And so very fast, they hit a maximum number of fat cells and they literally can't make any more fat cells. And that's why they'll become diabetic at way lower body mass indexes, way lower body fat percentages, way lower fatness, way lower body masses. I mean, they just can't get as fat. And then you have, some Caucasians on My 600-Pound Life who might even still be sort of insulin sensitive at, 500 pounds, or just these extremes, because they can make more fat cells. So Dr. Bikman is correct. Obesity is just kind of happening over here in parallel, and it's really just about how many fat cells can you sprout. And that's mostly genetic. I mean, that is hugely genetic. So
I agree with that. Totally.
Right.
Yep. I think in population, I think that really does account for these, I guess, for lack of a better word, ethnic disparities or differences, where we know that certain populations will have polymorphisms in genes that are responsible for hyperplasia, like PPAR gamma. And that's part of the reason. So I agree with everything Ted said. I think it's perfect. I couldn't say it any better myself. But maybe it almost, I can't help but mention this now because it just feeds into it so well. Part of my defense of the fat first paradigm when it comes to insulin resistance is that you can take someone who's diabetic and you give them a PPAR gamma activator, which is a drug like the TZDs. And all this drug does is switch on PPAR gamma in fat cells to make fat cells that had been limited in their growth only through hypertrophy. It basically says, oh, now you can be hyperplastic. And so it initiates hyperplasia and the disease starts to get better. And so it's a drug that is quite specific to the fat cell. And by targeting the fat cell, and to my knowledge, it's quite unique in that regard. Metformin, that's acting everywhere. And frankly, who the hell knows what it's actually doing? We have a lot of theories. I've myself even studied some of those and published a paper, but we know so little about metformin, but it acts everywhere. But these thiazolidinediones are, from what I understand, very, maybe not totally, but quite unique to the fat cell in that it starts promoting hyperplasia. And to Ted's, what Ted's saying, what's so relevant is it basically says your ability to store fat now in fat is limitless. And so you have that paradoxical shift where you're getting fatter, but you're becoming more insulin sensitive.
Yeah, I'll just jump in just to make sure people understand that. So this hyperplasia, so you're creating more fat cells so that each one doesn't get overstuffed. So
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh, and I want to say that I am also I do agree with the fat first model that basically insulin resistance is occurring at the fat cell. Muscle is involved, but the time scale of muscle is so tiny and so short that it almost doesn't matter. So basically, if I'm like just a massively insulin resistant type 2 diabetic, whose whole body is saturated with energy, glucose, and fat, and I'm horrifically insulin resistant, I could literally go out and just run a marathon, and within a few hours, my muscle insulin sensitivity gets way better, and my whole body insulin sensitivity gets way better almost instantly. But then it just goes right back to the way it was as soon as I eat something and fill my muscles up with glucose again. And so the muscle part, when I say it happens first, that's like 10 minutes after you eat a meal, or just a couple days of not exercising at all. So it almost doesn't matter, because the fat cell stuff is happening on this huge time scale of weeks and months and years, and it takes forever to reverse it. But you can just like sprint around the block 10 times and fix your muscle insulin resistance. So it's a crucial factor, like to be severely insulin resistant at the whole body level and hyperglycemic, you have to have your muscles saturated as well. But since you can reverse that so fast, it almost doesn't really matter. Well, I mean, it matters. I have to mention it. In fact, exercise is a big deal. But I do agree with predominantly whole body insulin resistance is mostly just about overfilling your fat cells.
Yeah, in fact, to Ted's point, in fact, I should have thought of this. There is evidence to show that the muscle cell can play a very primary role. And Ted mentioned like inactivity. We published a paper. I was a co-author on a paper from colleagues at the medical school at the University of Utah, and they found that bed rest, or that immobility, creates demonstrable insulin resistance in I think it was 2 days of immobility. And interestingly, they found that it was actually through this activation of some inflammatory pathways, which is why I like to include that. But even still, Ted is right. You can have a muscle-centric paradigm, and that the immobility studies, and there are multiple out there. Our study was only unique because it pinpointed a role for inflammation, or the inflammatory signaling in that process. But it's been known for a long time that in the absence of any changes in fat cell, immobility is causing insulin resistance to some degree, and it's all at the muscle.
So does this, are we
so
kind
Ted
of
and I are determined, we're determined to agree, Brian.
Yeah. So it sounds like we're kind of on the same page there. But okay, we should move on to then what are the other ideas? What are the competing hypotheses? And we started off emailing about the carbohydrate-insulin model, which is kind of like the Gary Taubes idea. You know, I had him on a long time ago. He's just saying it's just the carbohydrates that are causing this. And Ted's been saying this idea has been dead. He's been saying that online for a long time. And I think Ben thinks that it's not all there at all either. But maybe what is there? Or maybe, I don't know, if maybe someone should explain what that is in the first place, the carbohydrate-insulin model.
So we are shifting the topic a little bit now then, right?
Yes.
So we are getting into more obesity explicitly. So the carbohydrate insulin theory is that obesity is 100% a phenomenon of, well, this is how some would characterize it, because I'm an advocate of the insulin theory, but only because I think there's nuance that is too often overlooked. And I kind of have to say that up front. So on the most strict sort of orthodox view of the insulin theory of obesity is that you cannot, that carbohydrates are essentially the single culprit, and it's strictly in light of what it does to insulin. That insulin is the great mediator. Your excess carbohydrate is being consumed, insulin is elevated. That is the sole cause of obesity. That would be the extreme view of that paradigm. Then on the other end, of course, is that it's strictly 100% a matter of thermodynamics, calories in, calories out. There's nothing more complicated than that. Now, I'm doing both sides a disservice, I think, by saying it that way. And I don't want to get ahead of myself kind of defending the insulin version of things, but that's how I would define the carbohydrate insulin model in its kind of purest, most orthodox view, perhaps. Ted, does that kind of jive with what you were thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. If you just strawmanned the carbohydrate insulin model all on the way off on one side, it's just that carbs raise insulin, which makes you store all your calories as fat. And on the other side, it doesn't literally matter what you eat. It's just straight calories. And like both, obviously the answer is somewhere in the middle. And the only question is like exactly where in the middle it is.
Yep. In fact, I agree 100%. And I would, in fact, that's why it is in the middle where Ted and I think, meet quite comfortably, where Ted and I both very much agree that trying to count calories and you're giving, say, protein equal calorie to glucose, that's laughable. That's just laughable. In fact, that's part of why I hate invoking thermodynamics in biology. I'll be a little extreme here. I think it was one of the biggest mistakes life sciences or biology ever made, because the laws of thermodynamics, I think in their truest origins, were never intended to be applied to biology, just because we cannot account for every variable that we are living. We are in an open system. And so our attempts to perfectly reconcile calories in and calories out, I think is so silly, because we just cannot account for the nuance. And protein is just such an obvious example. It isn't used for energy in all but rare instances. It has such a high cost of just digestion and incorporation or absorption. And so I think in that middle, I guess back to my point, my idea of defending the insulin model is that there is considerable, certainly rodent evidence to defend it, that isocalorically, when you manipulate insulin, you can have almost total control over, with genetic models, over obesity. Now, I know that's an extreme situation, but it still does provide some defense. I'm also unaware, and Ted may in fact be able to counter, I'm unaware of any instance of human obesity happening without elevated insulin. Now, I know that's correlational, that's observational, so I recognize that weakness. It's just to quote a famous physiologist that I'm always referring to, George Cahill. He said, he was asked once, what is the difference between obesity and lean? And he just said, obesity does everything at a higher insulin. Again, maybe that's just correlational and not causal. That would be the scrutiny of it. But nevertheless, my view on defending the insulin paradigm is that I think it helps us account for energy use, where insulin helps a cell, insulin in part determines what a cell does with the energy that it has. And insulin is so determined to be storage, or to promote storage or anabolism, that it will indeed depress metabolic rate. And I can say that of the cell itself, like at the level of the cell, metabolic rate will be dampened when insulin is present. I say that with authority just because I've literally done those studies. I've seen that. I can't unsee it. So I know that insulin is exerting a thermodynamic effect that isn't accounted for in a pure calories in, calories out model.
Ted?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things about that. Well, one issue I have with the carbohydrate insulin model is the idea of the internal starvation part. Now, the carbohydrate insulin model keeps kind of changing. First, it was carbs raise insulin, which partitions energy and fat. And then it was like, oh, carbs change the insulin to glucagon ratio, because as Dr. Bikman taught us all, protein affects the glucagon ratio, even though it's insulinogenic. And so now they're like, oh, yeah, it's more like carbs raising the insulin to glucagon ratio, and that might change energy expenditure. But like the classic carbohydrate insulin model was that carbs raise insulin, which makes fuels in the bloodstream less available because insulin is suppressing lipolysis, and then you have this internal starvation. And I have a huge problem with that, because that's never been documented or proven at all anywhere. Like, basically, the carbohydrate insulin model classically said that there's this dynamic phase of fattening where you eat carbs, insulin goes up, that shuts off lipolysis, the free fatty acids in the bloodstream drop, and then you're really hungry, and then you eat more downstream. But they've never actually documented this drop in fuel availability. And actually, if you look at humans or animals as they're getting fatter, at all times, there's more fuels in circulation. So there's always more glucose, more free fatty acids, more triglycerides. If you look at anyone in any stage of becoming obese or insulin resistant or diabetic, at every phase in this fattening process, there's more fuels available in the bloodstream compared to someone who's not getting fatter or not insulin resistant or not diabetic. And so this internal starvation thing just isn't really real, and it's never been documented, and it doesn't actually happen. And I have a huge problem with that. And and we have these, we have studies, if you look at Acipimox, which is a drug that you can take that blocks lipolysis just like insulin does, your free fatty acid levels drop. We have studies looking at Acipimox versus placebo, where you can drop free fatty acid levels in your bloodstream by 38%, and you actually don't get hungrier, you don't eat more, you don't gain weight. And so the whole internal starvation thing, not only does it not happen, but if you actually try to create that, doesn't seem to drive downstream eating. So I just think that part of it, I have a really big problem with that, and I don't see how that gets reconciled by anybody anywhere.
Well, I don't know, Ben, do you want to respond to that? Because I'm just interested in
Well,
what does
I
cause the eating. We'll get to that after. Like, what does cause people to overeat energy?
yeah, well, that's a big topic,
Well,
and one
that'll
I
be the
don't know.
ending. But Ted,
Yeah, sure, and I'll speak as
yeah.
capably as I can on that, which won't be too much. But yeah, so Ted actually introduced a nuance of the carbohydrate insulin model that I had overlooked, in part because it goes kind of out beyond the fat cell to that more whole body energy availability. And in fact, Ted mentioning it that way reminded me that David Ludwig, he's a very good scientist, love him or hate him. I appreciate his work. He did publish a paper last year finding acutely, and this might be nuance that Ted is in. Ted, you might be including this in your general discussion. And I can't speak to the kind of long-term energy availability, but I think Ted is right. Overall, in a situation in the metabolic milieu that is driving obesity has to happen with an abundance of energy. I would never attempt to counter that. There must be sufficient energy that the fat cell is growing. But acutely, David's work, and I wish I could, it was definitely last year, David Ludwig and Kara Ebeling, they published a paper just looking at the energy availability in the wake for, I think, up to 3 hours following a high carbohydrate or a low carbohydrate meals in these subjects. And energy availability was defined as all lipids, glucose, and I think even ketones. So all those constituted the sum of energy availability, which I think pretty much gets, virtually all of it. And they found that it was down in the people that ate the high carbohydrate meal in that 3 hour window. There was a significantly lower area under the curve. And now, so that to me defends at least some part of it, at least an acute part of the carbohydrate insulin model. And I wish I could remember the citation, but it was last year. But nevertheless, so it defends that to a degree, but it might not explain it. Well, I can't extrapolate, and I don't want to. That's terribly unscientific. All we can say is, at 2 or 3 hours, wherever it ended, that's where it ended. And then who knows what's happening for the remaining 21 or 22 hours. I cannot speak to that. And I don't think David, even from his own data, would. But it does support the idea that insulin will, at least acutely, drive down energy availability. And that's not surprising in and of itself, because insulin wants to store energy. But the degree to which it would happen and the long-term consequences, that I think is certainly a matter for discussion and certainly future research. But there was that study that does support at least an acute reduction in energy availability.
And that's a good point. And I actually concede that glycemic index and raising and falling of glucose after eating, I think that is real. I think that is a form of energy that's falling in the bloodstream, and that actually does drive downstream hunger. And we have studies that basically prove that if you eat a high glycemic index breakfast, you're going to be hungrier several hours later. You're going to eat more several hours later. And so I agree that the glycemic variability is definitely a factor. And so that's one of the things that I like about low carb diets, is that people aren't driven by this falling glucose in the middle to late postprandial, 3 to 4 hours after eating a high glycemic load meal. You're going to feel this glucose falling, and that does drive people to eat more. But I don't think that's so. I can actually appreciate that part of the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, is falling glucose does drive downstream eating, and that's a very real thing. But I also don't think that explains the fact that as you're getting more and more obese, you have more fuel availability pretty much all the time, especially free fatty acids and triglycerides. And so it kind of explains it to me. I mean, it does explain it.
No, you're right, Ted. I think you're absolutely right. that I think that long-term phenomenon, and I would say it's because the body's becoming insulin resistant, but no question, energy availability. Ted, in fact, if I can give you one of the most sincere compliments I could, I think you have been the most eloquent and justified advocate of looking at energy and scrutinizing it being distinct from classic view of macronutrients, but also appreciating the energy toxicity that really, I think we would have to say, must accompany weight gain.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So to recap, Ted, I think we're talking about the same study. I've seen this study a lot where, you eat the high carb meal compared to the low carb meal, and your blood with the high carb meal, it goes down, your blood sugar you go hypoglycemic, and that coincides with perceived hunger, which they asked the participants, which also corresponded with exact time. He's saying, what is it, 3 to 4 hours with ghrelin production. Then ghrelin is the hunger hormone. So there's something going on there. And to me, you were talking about glycemic index and stuff like that. It's the amount of processing of the carbohydrate that would matter. So I've always been into this idea that, and there's two things going on. Ben mentioned protein. Protein should not be considered like the other energy macronutrients. I think we all agree on that. Protein, I think that is a huge mistake. I think you're kind of alluding to looking at thermodynamics in food is a mistake, but I think part of that is looking at protein as the same as energy. And then also that refined energy is not the same as whole energy. As in, you have a whole potato is different from a piece of white bread. So how does that fit into the carbohydrate insulin model? Because we're kind of saying there's something to it, but are we saying that only on that per meal basis, or what are we saying?
Well, I would say that we know that energy density is a huge big deal, but that applies equally to carbs and to fat. So you can add refined fat to pretty much any omnivore mammal's diet and it will get fatter, and fat is fattening. And we have study after study after study. If you want to fatten rats or mice or pigs or humans or other primates, you can just add a refined fat to their diet and they will just automatically get fatter. And that's another reason why I don't necessarily agree with the classic carbohydrate insulin model. But that speaks not as much to the role of insulin, but to energy density. And so, humans eat, 4 or 5 pounds of food a day, and we kind of eat this much food irrespective of how many calories are in it, more or less. And so if you add a refined fat to your food, you're literally going to just automatically eat more calories. And we have a bazillion studies that prove this. And so I think refining is a big problem for a number of reasons. Number one, if you add refined fat to your food, because it has such a huge caloric density, you're just going to passively automatically overeat calories because you're used to eating the same weight and volume of food. And now when you add refined carbs to your meal, you not only do you have the same phenomenon going on, but because of this huge glycemic hit you get, you might have higher dopamine spike in your brain. And then you also might be more victim to the falling glucose on the backside of that 3 to 4 hours later, driving even more eating behavior. So I see refined fat and refined carbs as both contributing massively to obesity, with the carbs being possibly worse because of these glycemic excursions driving short-term eating, but then the fat being also equally bad because of the extremely high energy density and how easy it is to passively overeat. And that honestly, that's why, if you really, really, really want to fatten anything the most, it's always 50% fat, 40% carbs, 10% protein. I mean, there's just this magic formula. It's basically a Reese's peanut butter cup. And that's just optimal fattening zone for pretty much any omnivore mammal. But I would say refined carbs and refined fats are both contributing almost, 50-50. And so that's not as much about carbs and insulin as the CIM would predict that it is.
Before Ben goes, I'm there. I'm kind of in this model of the level of processing is the ultimate theory of everything. because it's not the carbohydrate insulin model. It's just, if you refine things, whether it's carbs or fat, you're screwed. And then protein is just kind of the counter to that. It's like, well, we just want more protein because they are not refined energy, being carbs or fat, and all the things we already talked about protein. But Ben, please jump in.
Yeah. This was great. I agree with everything Ted's saying. I think, to my knowledge, there's never been a study that has put humans or even rodents on a diet of pure glucose, isocalorically matched to a diet of pure fat. I don't think that's been done. But boy, it would sure be nice. It would kind of get to some of these things. So I do think that the modern obesity epidemic is without a doubt a confluence, this metabolic storm of refined carbohydrates and refined oils. The two together really drive the problem. I agree with that 100%. Now, I don't think that diminishes a role for insulin, because what would be compelling, of course, in that other study of extreme macronutrients would be what happens when there's caloric availability, when sufficient calories that would normally promote growth, but in the absence of insulin, and I hate to invoke type 1 diabetes, but in an untreated type 1 diabetic, that represents, I guess, the closest we can come, where their insulin is essentially zero. They can be eating thousands of calories and they're just wasting away. Now, there's, of course, a lot going on, but often I know people, to try to maintain the laws of thermodynamics in living organisms, which I think is always at fault, they will say, well, it's just because of the excess glucose that is spilling into the urine. But we know that it doesn't come close to accounting for the calories that should be accounted for, that the person is apparently expending. We also know that, kind of back to one of my earlier comments, but I fear that I'm getting off topic, so I'll finish with this and get back on topic. In an untreated type 1 diabetic, their metabolic rate is about 300 calories higher than when they're treated with insulin. That was a study from Minnesota in the 80s. So just kind of back to the idea of, insulin matters here, even in the laws, even when it comes to calories in, calories out. But I like everything Ted just said. In fact, Ted, I've heard you say something else before that I love, which is, and I think it's relevant here, which is scrutinizing insulin excursions and differentiating those from basal insulin, right, Ted? I think I've heard you say that kind of thing before, and I thought it was very well said, and a very good point that I don't think I would have made, but it's one that resonated with me, that as much as I am wary of carbohydrates, in part because of what they do to insulin, and also in part because they're just, not essential. So let's focus on the essential first, and then let the carbs kind of come in as bonus, if you will. But I think it's so important to note the difference between you've eaten something starchy and sugary and you get a spike, and if you come back down nice and quick, well then, hey, that is not going to promote insulin resistance. It really is that tone, that basal hyperinsulinemia, and hyperinsulinemia itself may be defined by many different people in different ways. I would say it's insulin's higher than that body needs it to be to maintain normal glycemia. But then, Brian, with regards to the refining of it all, naturally, the more we refine it, we take out things that would attempt to mitigate the glycemic and insulin response, like fiber, of course. And we know this happens. If you eat fruit versus drink the exact same amount of calories from that same fruit, you'll have a difference of insulin by about 30% or so. So we know that changing processing the carbohydrate makes an enormous difference. And there was a rodent study, and I hate to invoke rodent studies too liberally, I really do, because it's not humans, but I think here it's relevant. They gave the exact same kind of chow to the animals. One was the original pellet that when I'm feeding my lab mice, it's just little pellets, like what you put in your Traeger or grill almost, just little pellets of food, versus ground up into like a little mush. They overate and they got much. No, it was isocaloric. It was isocaloric. So there was no overeating. They were calorie matched. And yet the processed food eaters got fatter than the ones eating the exact same food, the exact same calories. It's just, I would say, maybe the effort of digestion and the structural maybe component of any fiber that might have been in there was sufficiently changed that digestion and absorption was just that much easier. And now the animal got fatter than the laws of perfect thermodynamics said they should.
That's super interesting. I'll let Ted respond to that because, yeah, I've talked to people about that. The GLP and GIP-1, or I may have got those backwards, GLP-1 and GIP, these hormones that are released when you have the refined foods and the whole food matrix is destroyed. Like the difference between, fruit juice and fruit, or making a smoothie and you're breaking down the walls that changes digestion. So that seems to kind of be a point for the carbohydrate insulin model, where there is this hormonal factor, right? That different things are released and insulin's reacts in a different way. So Ted, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with everything Dr. Bikman said, and I am very familiar with this study where you take the exact same chow, you powderize it, and the rodents get fatter. And honestly, I think that, in general, humans are cuisinivores. Like, we evolved to process and cook our food, and part of that is because you can extract more nutrients, but you can also extract more calories. So there's a lot of foods that if you chop it up and grind it and cook it and pulverize it, and all the processing that we've always done, Homo sapiens have always done, you get more nutrients and you get more calories from the same food. And we did that as part of this, expensive tissue hypothesis, where our guts got smaller and our brains got bigger. And so we kind of needed to do this. And that worked really well for us for like a bazillion years. But now that we've got sugar and oil, the ultimate refinement of carb in the form of sugar and fat in the form of oil, it's kind of working against us at that point. I would still say that that's probably, I would say that, okay, now, and I agree with Dr. Bikman so much that you absolutely have to have insulin in order to become obese and maintain obesity. And we know so much about this from type 1 diabetics. But then I will also say that, in my opinion, insulin it's kind of passively just reacting to the fuels that are in the bloodstream. Insulin's trying to clear fuels out of the bloodstream. And in a type 1 diabetic, all these fuels just flood out of storage into the bloodstream, and normally insulin would react to that and be holding those back in. But when you don't have the insulin, you're just overwhelmed with all these fuels and this uncontrolled lipolysis and glycogenolysis, and all your fuels are melting down into the bloodstream. But so I see insulin as having more of a passive or reactive role. It's just reacting to what shows up in your bloodstream. And it's not really, it's the cart and not the horse. It's not really driving anything. It's just reacting to the fuels that are there somehow. And so I see insulin as a little bit more of it's absolutely required for obesity, but it's also just kind of reacting to what's already there, if you know what I mean.
Ben,
in fact, I agree. There's no question. Ted I don't think anyone can disagree with what he's saying. Insulin is no question reacting to nutrients in the blood. No question. Any other moving of insulin, like cephalic phase responses, is so modest to be negligible in this situation. And so there's no question, I think, beyond debate, that insulin is reacting to energy or nutrients that are in the blood. And then I would just say, and I think even Ted is saying this, insulin to some degree is a mediator of what then happens at the fat cell with regards to that energy. Now, one thing that's interesting here is, I'm reminded of a conversation I had on a podcast previously where someone was invoking this guy was invoking, I don't want to name names, he was invoking the ketavans and saying, well, see, carbohydrates aren't the problem. It's the ketavans that they were eating starchy meals, and they eat, tuberous vegetables quite heavily, or these were studies done, I don't know, decades ago. And that was a defense of the seed oil theory, which is that obesity and insulin resistance is not a matter of carbohydrates or insulin. It's strictly a matter of seed oils. And I think that sentiment has value. I consider seed oils to be a secondary cause of insulin resistance, not a primary cause. And that's maybe too off topic for now, but back to the ketavans. That same kind of study supports the sentiment that I heard Ted once say, and that I'm now echoing and I'm stealing Ted's ideas. And every time I talk about it, Ted, I'm not crediting you, and I'm not gonna. It's just too brilliant of an idea. But the difference between insulin excursions, bolus insulin or basal insulin, and what is overlooked in that when people invoke the Catavans and use that as a model to say, well, it's seed oil, not carbohydrate, because they ate high carbohydrate diet, I would say it fits into this conversation. I swear, it was a tangent,
I wanted to
but
get
it had
into
a
this.
connection.
Don't worry.
Well, it's because, of course, their carbohydrates were these big, tough, tuberous vegetables. And to Ted's point, they would process it, they'd learn to cook it or ferment it or whatever in order to extract more energy than they otherwise could. But that is not the same as turning it into a smoothie, or whatever we're going to do with it nowadays. But what's so interesting, without a doubt, they would have had some insulin spike from eating those tuberous vegetables, no question. But their fasting insulin levels, their basal insulin levels, were like 4 microunits per mil. In the average American, I think we're at 9 microunits per mil. And that might seem like a modest difference. I'm sure it's higher than that now. But that, to me, so as much as someone wants to invoke the Catavans as a defense or evidence in favor of the seed oil theory of it all, I would say, well, that same evidence could just as well be used to defend the hyperinsulinemia or insulin model of it all. Not that either is relevant at the exclusion of the other. I'm not at all saying that. But I do put insulin as a primary driver of insulin resistance, not the only one, but a primary driver. And then I put seed oils as a secondary driver, just because the biomedical models don't support linoleic acid as much as it's a villain. And it has, that's a deserved reputation, but it isn't, you can't create insulin resistance with linoleic acid in biomedical models like you can with, say, insulin or inflammation or cortisol and epinephrine.
I love this. I wanted to get into all of these things, so I'm glad you brought it up. I'm really interested in, the polyunsaturated fatty acids or linoleic acid is what seed oils are mainly comprised of. And also the area under the curve idea. This is kind of, I don't know which we should get into first, but the area under the curve kind of would explain why some of these high carbohydrate eating people, and it's much more than the Catavans, there's other examples of it, that still can be perfectly healthy, and it can explain vegan diets. I was confused on this too. It explains the potato diet. Many years ago, I was like, I don't get it. How are they doing that? Because it is this area under curve is also talking about level processing. These people are not eating Pringles and chips and processed, breads and all this stuff. They're eating whole foods.
Well, but even those examples, certainly those are processed, prostituted carbohydrates, but we could just as much say they're oil heavy as well.
Exactly.
And that's what we do with it. We don't just slice up a potato and say, here's your potato chip, and crunch through it. No, we fry it in oil. So everything we do to the carbohydrate now to make it as delicious as possible is mixing the two. And in nature, there may be maybe dairy is really the key exception. Carbohydrate and fat don't come together. Yep. Fat is either its own. Well, it's never on its own. It comes with fiber if it's coming from a fatty fruit, or it always comes with protein in, arguably the most natural resource or sources, which is going to be animal based. But this mix of carbohydrate and fat, it is of course the most palatable. It's of course the most fattening, and that may be why you don't get it in nature, except for little baby who's nursing mom, mammal baby to mammal mom.
Absolutely. And you're kind of talking about the hammer and the nail thing. I did a graphic on this. It's the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the seed oils might be the hammer, and then the refined carbs and sugars might be the nail, but they come together. They're both part of this process. So I don't like when camps get into like a hardcore into one or the other, but it sounds like it's kind of both. And that's kind of this energy toxicity model that both of you kind of talk about, where it's just, that's what we're talking about. There's too much energy coming from both of these sources. So I'll let Ted jump in.
Speaking to the area under the curve thing, and thanks for bringing that up, Dr. Bikman. There's this basal insulin. Like if you have a type 1 diabetic, they have a basal insulin that basically just keeps the fuels out of the bloodstream all night long, for example. And then they have mealtime boluses. And, your typical type 1 diabetic in America is using maybe 50% of their insulin as a basal and 50% for the mealtime spikes. You have somebody on a really low carb diet, they might be doing 80% of their insulin as a basal and just 20% for these spikes. But then you also have like these, these mastering diabetes guys who are vegan and fruitarians, and they're eating just super high carb, super low fat diets. And they're, the 80% mealtime insulin and 20% basal, like they've totally flipped it around.
Well said, Ted. Well said. That is well said.
And it's really interesting how you can flip those two. And so what I see in my clinical practice is that you can get your mealtime insulin requirements really, 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 really low by eating hardly any carbs. But you can also get your basal insulin requirement really low by hardly eating any fat. I mean, I have patients on these insanely low fat diets whose, basal insulin, it might be 20 or 30 units a day before, and then they trim all the fat they can out of their diet. Now they're using, 9 units for basal or something. And so you can shrink down your mealtime requirements by getting your carbs really low. You can shrink down your basal requirements by getting your fat really low. And so it's almost like they're interchangeable. And in fact, they are interchangeable. And that's kind of why another reason I have a problem with the carbohydrate-insulin model, because they're definitely isocalorically interchangeable. And you have people lowering their type 1 overall requirement by getting the carbs low, by getting the fat low. And the smartest people are doing a little bit of both and eating these very high protein, high fiber, high satiety per calorie diets where their overall insulin usage is the very lowest. And that's why my argument is, hey, fat is contributing to your daily insulin requirement just as much as carbs are. And a lot of type 2 diabetics, they've learned from their continuous glucose monitor that, hey, if I eat carbs, my sugar shoots through the roof and then it comes back down a couple hours later. What they're not paying as much attention to is if they eat a bunch of fat, when they wake up the next morning, their blood sugar is significantly higher because they just raised their basal insulin requirement, which they may or may not be able to meet those needs. So it's kind of carbs and fat. You have to look at both of them. And that's why I'm all in on this energy model where you're kind of looking at carbs and fat both, because it's not just either or. It's it's definitely, they're interchangeable kind of.
I love it. And this is kind of your P to E diet, and you have a book as well. I'll shout that out. It's awesome. And Ben, back to, a lot of people just don't understand this because if you just look at CGM, you might not notice this. So I love getting into these nuances. So people, I have a CGM on now just to mess around with it, and I'm learning about it. And I do, even back to the thing of the swings, like I'm eating carbs and it's fine. It's going up, it's going back down, but then I am hungrier a couple hours later. So, there definitely is this thing I'm playing around with, and what is the balance? And, we could talk about like if there is an ideal diet or way to balance these, but, I love this nuance of the basal versus the postprandial. So Ben, maybe you could jump in.
Yeah. So I think there's some interesting nuance here where, I'm an insulin resistance guy. I'm not really an obesity guy, but I still think there's a place where these are meeting here in this conversation. Of course, there's lots of places where they meet in the body, but I think that obesity must be a function of insulin and energy. That I think that in a way you can't pull those apart. Maybe you can in some like the model I mentioned where it's extreme macronutrients, 100% of one, 100% of the other. But in practice, which I think is what it really matters here, you just can't pull the two apart. That if there's an excess of energy, insulin's going to want to tell the body to store that. You don't want to keep energy in the blood. And that's why insulin's responding to the available energy, to Ted's point earlier. In contrast, if you were just artificially inflating insulin all the time, I think you will be driven to consume more energy. At least David Ludwig's paper supports that a little, that available energy is down. And then we had that study we've all mentioned where the breakfasts varied in macronutrient content and they were hungrier. And I think that's important because as much as people want to look at the carbohydrate insulin model, and I don't know that people really do, but that it's all a matter of the insulin alone. I don't think you can really have sustained elevated insulin in the absence of a caloric deficit. That's incompatible with life. If you're bumping insulin up and you are essentially putting available energy to zero, well, then you're dead. You've deprived the brain of its glucose and its ketones, which are its two fuel. The glucose you've deprived because you've pushed it all into the muscle. The ketones you're depriving the brain of because you're telling the liver to stop making ketones. And so it really is, it's a bit of an artificial paradigm to just, I think push up either that it's 100% energy or 100% insulin, because you just can't really have one without the other. That's my view. Admittedly, some speculation, but that's my view in the context of obesity. And then you have to have them together. It's probably impossible to tease them apart, but in the case of insulin resistance, I think both of those have value, that there is something to be said for an energy toxicity. I would say that's primarily at the fat cell, and then it starts spilling into other tissues where the cell is essentially so full of energy that it just can't take any more in. That might be an unscientific way to say it, but insulin wants to keep force feeding every cell. The cell says, I'm done. So that would be the kind of defense of the energy theory, which I think is valuable. But in defense of the insulin model, I consider insulin a primary cause of insulin resistance. And again, I'm not saying obesity now, because you have evidence, multiple studies at all three biomedical models of cells, rodents, and humans. In every one of those models, in the absence of energy changes, if we just bump up the insulin, they do become insulin resistant. And that's not a unique phenomenon. It's not uncommon that high levels of hormones will deliberately desensitize cells. The cell will deliberately desensitize itself by downgrading the level of receptors or post-receptor signaling. So insulin, I can take cells. I've done this before. Muscle cells and fat cells and liver cells. Just increase the insulin, give it a day, and they're insulin resistant. Rodents, increase the insulin isocalorically, they become insulin resistant. Humans, increase the insulin in that. Now these are artificial studies though in human, and all of them. But where you increase the insulin in the humans by infusions or injections, and they do become insulin resistant. But back to the energy idea, you cannot be bumping up the insulin chronically unless there's enough energy to keep the body, or I would say brain, fueled. So as much as I'm defending an insulin paradigm, just because you can, in fact, make cells, rodents, and humans insulin resistant by doing nothing more than bumping up the insulin, those are always acute studies. And again, they have to be acute, because if you're just bumping up the insulin in the absence of providing sufficient calories to keep some energy in the blood, you will die. And so you cannot tease one away from the other, in my mind. As much as I do defend insulin, I consider it a primary cause of insulin resistance, just because you literally can cause it with just insulin alone. Well, you can't, because if you take away the energy, there's always energy in the system. Yeah. So as much as I'm saying insulin alone, I'm wrong. I can't say that. Well, there's always energy in the system. The absence of energy is death.
But maybe Ted's saying, well, where is that energy? Where is that insulin coming from? Or why is that extra insulin coming from? Or I'll let you respond, Ted.
Well, no, and I'd say Ted said that. Yeah. And I agree with it. Insulin responds to the energy in the blood.
Well, I totally agree with Dr. Bikman. You can't really tease those apart. But like really, really big picture, for me, insulin is kind of just, again, responding like the cart, not the horse. And in fact, and this is super nerdy and geeky, and I don't know who's going to appreciate this. Probably nobody. If anyone's even still watching this, like there's one person who'll appreciate this. But insulin and leptin are
Brian and I will. Brian and I will appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Insulin and leptin are both hormones that are super ultra important to your body when they're low, and basically don't mean crap when they're high. So like leptin, low leptin will make every animal on earth just freaking starving. You're starving to death. It's an emergency signal. You're going to eat everything in sight. Low leptin is like this massive alert to your body that you're starving. You eat everything you can. And that's universal, and that's strongly conserved in all species. And high leptin doesn't mean crap. Like we think, oh, maybe there's a little bit of leptin resistance. Doesn't really mean anything. You can just inject people with 1 billion tons of leptin. Nothing really happens. Yep. It's like low leptin, super critical. You're starving to death. Huge, big deal. Super high leptin might not mean anything. Like the way that humans keep from dying from starvation is low leptin. It's a massive signal to eat. But you know what keeps humans from just getting infinitely fat? Predation, like being eaten by predators, which we kind of don't have anymore. So it's not like leptin, if it's low, you got to eat. And if it's high, you're going to stop eating. No, leptin makes you eat, and nothing about leptin makes you stop eating. It's predation that makes you not get too fat, but we don't have predators. So the zombie apocalypse will probably fix all that. Yeah. But basically, insulin's kind of the same way. When insulin's super low, every fuel in your bloodstream just massively gets released. Like everything. You have this, type 1 diabetics, they just have off the charts lipolysis, glycogenolysis, your bloodstream just filled with ketones, glucose, free fatty acids, and anything you've got. But high insulin kind of, like it only takes a tiny whiff of insulin to shut down lipolysis. Very, very, very little. And as you get higher and higher, well, yeah, it tends to like drop your blood sugar to zero and you die. But basically, if you could disentangle it from that, it's not really saying that much to your body. And so the insulin is kind of just reacting to too much energy in your bloodstream. And in fact, I'm going to go a little bit out on a limb here. Like I've said over and over that hyperinsulinemia is terrible, and pathologic hyperinsulinemia is associated with every chronic disease you could name, on and on and on. It's absolutely terrible. But the insulin itself is just a proxy for energy toxicity. It's just responding to too much energy in your cells, too much energy in your bloodstream, too much energy everywhere, and all the bad stuff that does. And the insulin itself is just kind of a marker or a placeholder of this energy toxicity that's the real problem. You know what I'm saying? Because as insulin gets higher and higher and higher, it doesn't really mean that much the way it means a really big deal when it's super low. So, okay, I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. My response only is that I don't know I don't know how you would. Well, Ted, you'll just reply. So I would still defend hyperinsulinemia as a driver of disease itself, absence of available energy, simply because insulin, we can't diminish its actual role as a signaling hormone at literally every cell of the body. So I would say absence of energy, which I agree is going to be a driver of insulin. The hyperinsulinemia itself, absence energy, is going to be pathogenic, where it's having, just by nature of insulin, binding insulin receptors on endothelial cells, it will change nitric oxide, or theca cells of the ovaries changing hormone expression, or energy uptake in the hippocampus, something we're working on now. So I wouldn't want to diminish the actual pathogenicity of insulin or hyperinsulinemia, but so energy can be viewed as a driver of hyperinsulinemia. I think that's a very justified view. But then I would still say the energy toxicity itself is causing problems, including hyperinsulinemia. And then distinct from the energy toxicity, the hyperinsulinemia, just by nature of insulin binding the cells and eliciting biochemical responses, that itself will be pathogenic, independent of the energy toxicity.
And like you said, I guess we never, ever, ever would be able to disentangle the two to see like what just high insulin would do by itself without the energy toxicity, or vice versa. I mean, well, actually, we do see what the energy toxicity does without the insulin in uncontrolled type 1 diabetics, and it's pretty bad. So I agree. I'm more afraid of the energy toxicity than I am the insulin itself. And I'm kind of using like what happens when your leptin's really high as a model for that, which seems to be nothing really that, I mean, it's probably bad, but it doesn't seem to be devastatingly bad, like uncontrolled type 1 diabetes and energy toxicity from that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything else? Because I want to move on before we get to why this energy toxicity develops. You always got to get to the root cause, obviously, or this will be our grand finale. But I want to get back to the PUFA part because I know, you brought it up. Is it the actual, makeup of these oils, or is it just the refined nature of them? So, could you just say butter would be the same as a seed oil?
In fact, I bet Ted has wonderful thoughts. I'll just start then. We do know in rodent evidence that they are not the same. I'm sure we all can think of this study published in an open access journal, PLOS1, where they gave animals isocaloric diets, and I think it was coconut oil. Do you guys remember this one? It was coconut oil, soybean oil, and I think one more, maybe olive oil. And isocalorically, the soybean oil eating animals did get fatter than the others. And then I would come back to a point I was touching on earlier, where I consider linoleic. So that's touching on the obesity aspect of it, where I'm only aware of that one study that shows that there is perhaps something a little more obesogenic to that particular fat than, say, a different one of equal caloric value. But in the context of insulin resistance, I consider linoleic acid a secondary cause because if I incubate cells with linoleic acid, they don't become insulin resistant. And so in fact, I've literally done that study before. It doesn't become insulin resistant. In humans, anytime you start infusing fat, it becomes insulin resistant. To Ted's point earlier, the only thing you need and to the energy point, you just start flooding the system with more energy and you get insulin resistance. But I view linoleic acid more of a culprit in light of what it does to fat cells. That's the only area I can speak to. Linoleic acid, of course, people say it's pro-inflammatory because it can turn into arachidonic acid, and then that gets converted into other pro-inflammatory molecules like prostacyclins and thromboxanes. But I can't really speak to that. I don't know the degree to which that actually happens in a body. But linoleic acid will accumulate in a fat cell. We know that for a fact. We do know that happens. As people eat more linoleic acid, they're putting more in their fat cells. And linoleic acid, some of its metabolites in any cell, but in a fat cell, will dictate hypertrophic growth of the fat cell. Now, not in and of itself, not alone it won't. I would still say you need energy to be pulling into the fat cell, and you have to have insulin to facilitate the growth of the fat cell. You just won't have a fat cell grow in the absence of it. So, but linoleic acid essentially takes a fat cell and says, hey, you might have been inclined to grow through hyperplasia, or linoleic acid metabolite. And it says, I'm not going to let you. I'm going to force you to grow through hypertrophy, which, as Ted mentioned at the outset of our conversation, is the sick way to get fat.
Ted?
This is not going to be super popular, but the whole low carbosphere is on this Pufaphobia thing where it's all PUFAs, it's all linoleic acid, and I'm not there personally. Okay, now I do think that industrial seed oil is one of the biggest contributors to the global diabetes epidemic that there is. It has zero nutritional value. It's dirt cheap. There are economic factors that it's we eating thousands of times more of it than we did 100 years ago. There are all these reasons why it's absolutely the biggest and worst thing in the food environment, period. Highest energy density, lowest nutrient value. It's a food we never ate before. It's dirt cheap, and economics drive people eating more of it. It's just like there's just a million reasons why it's literally the worst thing ever. So I think industrial seed oil is the worst thing ever and the single biggest contributor to obesity that we've got. I mean, it's a total nightmare. So I absolutely hate that stuff. But if you're just looking mechanistically at linoleic acid and trying to demonstrate to me why it's absolutely pure evil on a molecular level using biochemistry, I mean, there are just as many studies out there on saturated fats. I mean, you can drive just as much.
Probably more.
You can
probably more.
Studied more. Saturated fats probably been studied a lot more and blamed a lot more. But keep going.
You can literally anything you come at me with a linoleic acid study, I've got one for saturated fat. And in fact, the requirement for saturated fat in the human diet is exactly 0 because we can make our own, just like we can make glucose and we don't have to eat that. So, I think the low carbosphere has really kind of gone overboard on the Pufaphobia, because I do think you should try to minimize those, abso-freaking-lutely, but I think you might want to try to minimize the empty calorie glucose you're eating, the empty calorie saturated fat you're eating, the empty calorie MUFA you're eating, like any kind of empty refined calorie from carb or fat that you're eating is probably going to be bad, and it's probably going to contribute to something bad. And I'm just not there where I can say, oh yeah, PUFA is millions of times worse than saturated fat. And here's why. Like I'm not buying into that. And so I'm going to push back against that a little bit, honestly.
Interesting.
You know, in a way, I'm kind of glad to hear that, Ted. I'm a little cynical as well. In fact, you guys, let me flip this around, Brian, for a quick second. I was listening to a podcast where the guy was talking about how this is something I am very skeptical of, but they're saying how it's better to eat saturated fats because it makes fat cells more insulin resistant than PUFA fats, and then that is more that facilitates greater fat loss. And I don't know that I believe that, in part because I can say I've never seen a study. I know that they're invoking this excess at complex 1, and complex 1's creating like a static head, and now you're just generating more reactive oxygen species, and that then is driving insulin resistance. I get the theory. I just don't see it happen where you know, that's why they're, I think this guy, and I honestly don't mean to speak ill of him. If he's hearing me say this,
well, I want to bring it up. I want to bring
studies.
it up because before this podcast, I wanted to brush up, and I listened to you, Ben, on Paul Saladino's podcast, and he talked to you about this and talked about this idea that the PUFAs and the linoleic acid, make food. So go in. You can talk about that specific, because I wanted to bring that up.
Well, I'm happy to elaborate as much as I can, but if you guys know more about it than I do, then in all sincerity, I want to learn, because I know this is a topic that people are speaking out on with such fervor. I just don't know the data to support it, including people that I respect, where the idea is essentially that saturated fats are more beneficial to fat loss because they basically make the fat cells become more insulin resistant more readily than PUFA. And then if a fat cell becomes insulin resistant, then you're limiting its growth. And I agree with that latter portion of that whole story. I honestly don't know. And I heard people mention that it's more specific to abdominal fat. And it wasn't until they started eating stearic acid, saturated fat, that they really started losing their belly fat. I'm very cynical. I'm not saying it can't happen. I honestly want to be open-minded. I just don't know any evidence to support that. There's probably some out there, but man, I'd love to see it.
Well, Ted, what do you think? Have you heard these theories?
I mean, I want to believe in the Pufaphobia. I love Peter at Hyperlipid. I've read every single page of his blog. Like, I absolutely love the protons theory. I love the idea that saturated fat somehow is protective because it does create insulin resistance at the fat cell. I mean, but I can't do it. I don't buy the whole Ray Peat thing. Show me the bodies. Like, if you just look at the real world, you're just not seeing all the people who are fat and sick because of PUFAs. I mean, like, it's just not. I can't reconcile it with the real world, and I just can't be as afraid of PUFAs as everybody else is, and I'm sorry.
Yeah. Now let me add one thing, lest I be viewed as being too dismissive, because we are in fact doing a muscle study using linoleic acid. I would say if there's any reason to be wary of linoleic acid, but you could say the same thing to a degree probably of omega-3s, and I don't think anyone's saying they're bad. But the more unsaturated a fat is, the more likely it is to become a lipid peroxide, and those are damaging molecules. There's no question in my mind about that. lipid peroxides are horrific molecules that are very pathogenic. And the more unsaturated a fat is, the more potential it has to become a lipid peroxide, because it's every double bond that can be attacked. And so in that sense, I'm a defender of saturated fat, not because of thermodynamics, not because of obesity. It would just be the potentially subtle or not subtle effect of the lipid peroxides themselves. So that would be my defense of scrutinizing linoleic acid. But I am in turn scrutinizing the view that linoleic acid is a primary driver of obesity and insulin resistance. I just, especially, and I just like Ted, I say this with respect to the Hyperlipid blog. I think the biochemistry there is really fun. It's fun to read through, but one of my constant pursuits and frustrations with, say, academia is how granular things get, where we forget the physiological relevance of biochemistry. And case in point, there's a very well-respected professor here on my campus who tells his students in the chemistry department that the reason they should avoid saturated fats is because the saturated fats will stack so neatly in the blood vessel wall, driving an atherosclerotic plaque. That's just patently ridiculous. It defies all cellular biology. That is not how fats work in cells. And so it's laughable. Now, I'm not accusing Hyperlipid blog of that. I didn't mean to equate the two, but I'm saying that's an idea that the biochemistry looks very compelling. I just don't know how it would work. Why would abdominal fat cells be more susceptible to the saturated fat inducing insulin resistance than, say, gluteofemoral or visceral, for that matter? Because that's how it's stated. It's stated that the abdominal fat cells uniquely become insulin resistant. And that's what I've heard on other podcasts. And I would love to see the evidence on that. That's the kindest way I can reply to that.
Interesting. Well, yeah. And Paul Saladino talks about the Hyperlipid blog, and I think he credits that where he got this idea. So yes, Peter.
It's a compelling idea.
Yeah.
It really is. But we can't give it credit for just being an idea. To give it true credit, we have to say, well, what's the relevance of that idea? That, I think, to me, in my mind, that's where it starts to crumble a bit.
Well, people can go listen to that podcast that you did with Paul. Well, also, and to say, I think there are some people saying omega-3s could be bad when they're isolated out from whole foods and maybe without the vitamin E component to it. And if you're just talking about oxidized fish oil capsules, that it could be bad. So I think there is people talking about that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So I don't know. Anything else, Ted?
Oh no, I think
So you guys, but maybe to put a fine point on it, my curiosity where people are mentioning the abdominal fat cells specifically are becoming insulin resistant to saturated fat. Just to be clear, and my conscience can be clear, you guys don't know of evidence to support that idea.
No, and I don't even know if this that specific point, what that even.
Or any fat cells.
Okay.
We could say any fat cell, but the conversation I have heard multiple times that it was unique to abdominal fat cells. And my thought is, how is that going to be any different?
Right.
Well, I don't know much about that specific argument, and I don't even want to say. I'm just here to interview the scientists.
Yeah, you get to claim you're throwing it on me and Ted. They blame Ben and Ted.
No.
Brian.
I'm in the middle. I don't want to, act like the expert here, because I have people talking about both sides, right? I've had people on the show recently talking about the exact opposite of what you guys are saying. And there's
and again, I'm not saying linoleic acid doesn't matter. I do want to emphasize that it is uniquely susceptible to oxidation or peroxidation, and that is relevant. That is a highly pathogenic molecule. But strictly to obesity or insulin resistance, the metabolic realm that I'm more focused on, I think it warrants some caution.
Okay. Well, my idea is what's causing the energy toxicity. So maybe this has a role. And I think these guys that talk about the linoleic acid talk about satiety or, some reasons why people would overeat energy. So this is really the crux of it. I hope we have, some more time here. But what is causing people to overeat the energy? And I have some ideas. Ted and I had a great discussion Thanksgiving 2 years ago about satiety versus calories. And, you want to have a high satiety per calorie, and that many foods, especially the refined foods, do not have that. You strip out the fiber, you strip out all the other things, and you just get refined oils and sugars. That's not a high satiety for calorie. The calories to satiety doesn't match. And I think all these whole food diets, that even explains the Katavans and all these other people. They're eating pure, potatoes and all that. But they're eating a whole food where the satiety matches the calories. So therefore, you're good. So does this explain everything, Ted, in your mind, that if you eat whole foods, that it doesn't really matter if you eat the PUFAs or the seed oils, or, if you're, I'm guessing I should ask it differently. Why do people overeat?
So, for me, it really just comes down to satiety per calorie. And I know that you feel the same way. I mean, that's basically your idea, is that it comes down to satiety per calorie. And so for me, it's all about this satiety per calorie concept. And if everyone's going to eat to satiety, and if it took too many calories for you to get there, then you're just going to steadily gain weight. And I think there's a couple major drivers. Number one, energy density. So, you're going to eat your 4 or 5 pounds of food, sweet potatoes, yams. What the Katavans were eating, it's a very low energy density food. It's 1 calorie per gram. So you can eat 4 or 5 pounds of yams and it's only 2,000 calories. So you're just literally not going to get fat on this food. So versus, half a cup of sugar and a half cup of oil would be 2,000 calories. And that's, your satiety would be absolutely zero. Like, you'd be starving after that. So the refinement of carbs and fats dilutes out nutrients, and you get this higher energy density, nutrient devoid. So the energy density is higher and the nutrient density is lower at the same time. And you're just going to automatically overeat calories for the same amount of satiety. And it's protein dilution, it's mineral dilution, it's refined carbs and refined fats. I think that's half of the obesity epidemic. So half the obesity epidemic is refinement of carbs and fats that dilute out protein and nutrients, and you have to passively overeat calories to get satiety. The other half is the hedonic nature of high energy density carbs and fats together. You can give a refined carb and a refined fat together to any omnivore mammal, and it will automatically overeat by 30 to 40% of calories because it spikes dopamine in your brain, and it's so freaking tasty. And that's why, even if you know what you're supposed to be eating, you're going to be eating pizza and donuts because it's freaking amazing. And that's a full 50% of the obesity epidemic. It's just the hedonic overdrive of refined carbs and refined fats together. So I see this push-pull thing where obesity is being, pushed forward by passive dilution of nutrients from refined carbs and refined fats, but then pulled forward by the tasty hedonic nature of refined carbs and refined fats together. And you put those two together, and like everybody's, 91% of the entire world is over fat now.
I love it. Before Ben goes, I'm in love with that. And these are my thoughts exactly. And I've been, trying to write them down for years now. And I keep wrestling myself with this push-pull of, can that explain everything? Or would the pufas be a part of that? You know what I mean? Like, I'm like that. So half the time I'm like, yeah, that explains everything. Everything you just said, 100% agree with. That explains everything. And then sometimes I listen to these other arguments. I'm like, oh, well, and I think the pufas have like a huge part of that role.
The only way you're going to get a whole bunch of pufas is with a refined empty calorie fat. That's just going to be part of what I just outlined. So it almost doesn't matter.
I like that response. And Ben, now you can jump in.
Yeah, Ted, that is very well said. And the nice thing about how Ted stated that, and Brian, this is, I know, a sentiment you echo, or Ted's echoing you, is that it really makes it hard to tease out these other variables, like PUFA, where you can't have this hedonistic way of eating of high carb, high refined carb, high refined fat without really having the high PUFA. So someone can look at that view, everything Ted said, and they could say, well, it's because the high PUFA. Someone else could look at it and say, well, it's because of the insulin spiking nature of it. But I of course give some credence to that latter view. But the nice thing about the more the big view that Ted just stated is that it really does allow for some people to insert other variables as they want, but it's still the truth of the simplicity of the big view, which is this energy excess of the worst kinds, and then the hedonistic nature of it, which I agree with 100%. It's an incredible marketing tool, and it really is playing to our weaknesses and our drives to eat foods. Putting those two things together is the worst kind of hack. I hate to use that word, so let me think of something else. It's the worst kind of recipe for human or any organism, and that's because we don't see that. We don't get those two things together. Certainly not like we're getting now.
So yeah, I love this. I'm obsessed with this idea. It's no one wants to be fat and sick, yet we've ended up here. No one wants to overeat energy. We know we've pretty much decided it's energy toxicity. The fat cells are overstuffed. But how, right? You always got to go how, why, how, why. I hate these calorie counter ideas. It's just because you ate too many calories. Why did you eat too many calories? Why did you eat too much energy? Well, you didn't eat enough protein. You eat enough protein, then you're not going to eat as much of the energy. It's the satiety.
And because you mixed the two.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's because you mix the two. I don't know anyone who's going to sit back with a bottle of olive oil and a stick of butter and just be chomping on them. They would never want to do that. In contrast, no one's going to eat themselves sick on potatoes, plain, even boiled potatoes. You're going to have a boiled potato, maybe two. You are done. The absence of the other macronutrient. So one on its own is not hyperpalatable. It doesn't really light up the hedonic eating pattern. You only have that when you put I believe, now, I'm not an appetite expert. I'm really not, but you don't have the drive to overeat in the absence of those two things being together. When they come together, now you've lit that fuse and you can't really stop, or you have a hard time stopping.
Ted, anything more to?
Yeah, no, totally agree. That's exactly where I'm at. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's just why. Yeah, you just have to get to the why. It's the people just don't overeat just for fun. I mean, they do overeat just for fun, but they don't do it constantly and become obese and sick just for no reason. There's something going on a long-term basis. There's more going on here. I love that. I don't know if it's like a Gary Taubes thing or something, or it's like, especially when the 1980, like, did everyone just start to overeat all of a sudden in 1980 when that sharp uptick happened? I mean, there's something that happened there. And I guess we'd say that's when we introduced the dietary guidelines and everyone ate more refined grains and refined oils, right?
And it's bad business. It's bad business to keep the protein in there. Because protein is expensive and it's self-limiting because of its satiety inducing. It's so much more satiating, and I absolutely credit protein in that regard, that it's bad business, because then the person is eating whatever you made that has protein in it and they want to stop sooner. Well, that's not good for the bottom line. The shareholders want to make sure that the consumers are eating as much as possible so that the revenue is going up. So by taking out the protein, you're making a product that is less expensive, because protein is expensive, especially the best proteins. I say that, I know, as I made a meal replacement shake with my brothers. Animal protein, which is the best, no question, is expensive. So one, by taking it out, you're making your product less expensive. And two, by taking it out, you're encouraging people to overeat. And that's good for business because you'll sell more of whatever you're selling.
A lot of it is just money. And yeah, Ted,
it's all money.
It's all money.
Money.
The whole thing is money. You can trace it back. Yeah, 100 years. I mean, we're doing the film. I mean, there's a ton of evidence of the dietary guidelines being shifted by industry about all this stuff. We could, there's even some things about we can't afford this diet of healthy meat and fish and eggs and all this. We have this food stamps program. The government has to fund this. We can't afford to have them have good sources of protein. And the idea is like, oh, well, it's just, why not just all calories are the same, right? Because calories in, calories out. So let's just give them bread because that's cheap and we have a lot of it and we can afford it. So what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, well, and even more sinister, now there's it's open warfare on protein, animal protein, especially these days. And that's once again vested interests and also just a fundamental misunderstanding of human physiology and ecology, I'd say. But you combine all of this, the kind of attack on animal-based foods, and then the bottom line for producers and manufacturers, and we're in a difficult spot. So we need voices kind of like ours, to be frank.
True.
Well, that's why you're both in the film. This is all we do, because we're fighting the biggest uphill battle of all time. So, okay, so that we have a lot going on here. We should close it up. I told you guys I'd get you out of here soon. So maybe I'll start with my Uganda trip. So I went to Uganda and Tanzania. I spent time with these hunter-gatherers. Really cool. I mean, I could go on forever about it. But specifically, I saw in Uganda, everyone was in shape. Everyone was healthy. They didn't even have COVID in Tanzania, Uganda, which is an interesting thing. No, Matt, they didn't even know what it was. It seemed like, but they all seemed healthy. You know, maybe that's why. Until they hit 45, there was everyone I saw over 45, 50, especially the women in these markets, just gigantic women, and they had all whole foods, but then they had all these cooking oils in. So. This is, I want to hear you guys' thoughts. Maybe it's just, well, you have all these whole food diets, everyone's doing great, and then you add in extra energy and all of a sudden you're not so great. Or over time, I don't know why it took people this long to get to this level of seemingly, disease. Who knows? I mean, they could just be obese without the insulin resistance, but I want to see what you guys think of that.
This is part of my argument against the carbohydrate insulin model, and that is that refined fat is just unmercifully fattening. And we have tons of studies we've got studies in mice, rats, pigs, dogs, humans, and like you pour a refined fat on top of the existing feed, and every one of these omnivore mammals will just automatically passively overeat calories and gain 1 billion pounds. And so this is just unmistakably fattening. And I don't think you have to invoke some sort of mystical linoleic acid crap to explain this. This is just passive overconsumption of calories. When you pour a refined fat on your food, it tastes a little bit better and you eat a little bit more hedonically, but you're also just consuming way more energy calories. And all of this fat literally is just immediately passively stored in your fat cells. It has almost no thermic effect at all. It's just passively expanding your fat cells. Every single carbon atom in that fat has to physically go somewhere. You eat it and it immediately goes straight to your fat cells. If you want to gain 1 billion pounds, just pour any refined fat on top of the food you're already eating, and you will automatically eat more calories. You get the same satiety. It might even make you eat a little bit more hedonically, lowering satiety per calorie. And that's the explanation right there. And how do you explain that with the carbohydrate insulin model? You don't. You can't blame that on carbs. You can't blame that on insulin. You can't blame that on carbs and insulin. So it's a really good observation.
Well, and also part of that observation is they did not have junk food. They did not have sugar. They didn't candy. They didn't have sodas. They couldn't afford all of this stuff. They just afforded whole foods, and then the cooking oil started coming in, and they started using those. But I thought it was interesting.
I think that's relevant though. Where they're frying the potatoes, rather than boiling them, and there's no question that makes it more palatable. Or you're getting a lot more calorie with it too. But then it just makes it more palatable. You want to eat more of it.
So that could explain it all. I'm saying I think it's also interesting because people think it's all just, it's McDonald's, it's just fast food, it's this and that. And these people did not have fast food. They cannot afford fast food.
Yeah.
So
they now have carbs and fat together. That's what I'd say.
Right.
I guess but why do you think people maintained weight until 45?
That one I don't know that I can explain. I really wouldn't be able to tell you.
Well, I don't either. I just can't help but wonder what sort of environmental variables might be there. Are they just more physically active? Are they roaming around more? Is there something about 40s where they're now married with kids and they have more, although that's probably happening in the early 20s, but Yeah, I don't know. But I'd say to a degree, we see that here in the US, where I'm here on campus and there's a bunch of 20-year-olds. There's not a lot of them that are overweight. When I see them in 10 years, when they come back to visit, a lot more of them will be overweight. So I don't know that it's unique. Although I'm not discounting what you saw. You probably saw just a much more dramatic shift. I would just say maybe to a degree, they're seeing a more stark version of what we already see everywhere.
Yeah, well, it was interesting to see. All right. I guess we're out of time here. Thanks so much, guys. What else we got? You guys want to shout out? I shout out your books. Ted, I love the PE diet. You've been on a couple times. People should be well aware of your stuff. You're on Twitter. Anything else?
Oh, no, not really. Just doing the primary care doctor thing.
I love that. He's just doing his thing. Ben's over here doing his thing too. He's just like, yeah, I just do my research. And what else you got going, Ben?
Well, yeah. So thanks, Brian. And Ted, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. And I do hope the viewers leave with an appreciation of some of the nuance and then maybe some of the cynicism that we both share, that everyone ought to some degree about all of this, because a lot of the things I know I was saying, some of it was study-based, some of it was speculation. Nevertheless, you mentioned my book. Thanks. I'm actually more active on Instagram these days, guys. I find Twitter just to be just an unfriendly place, for lack of a better word. And so people can find me on Instagram at Ben Bikman, PhD. And then, like I mentioned, I have a couple side hustles just to try to make up for the poor pay that professors have. We'll see if they pay off someday. But one's a low-carb meal replacement shake, and people can learn more about that at Get Health. It's HLTH. And then Insulin IQ is a coaching platform that I've helped develop just to help people through low-carb diets.
I love it. I support it. And thanks so much, guys. It was really fun talking, and hopefully people learned some things here, and take care.
Yeah, Brian,
thanks, guys.
Thanks for bringing us together, and thanks to both of you guys. You guys are both amazing. Totally love it.
All right, guys.
Yeah, ditto. Thanks. See you, Ted. See you, Brian.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Go to nosetotail.org and get yourself some meat. Please share with friends and family. Give it a review on iTunes or any podcast app. Go to sapien.org to see what we're doing there. Has links to the film, to Nose to Tail, to the Sapien program, to the Sapien tribe, all the great things. Be part of the community. Eat well, live well. Let's do this, everyone. We'll see you next week.